Imagine you wake up one morning in 1962. You're 20 years old, you're married, and you're pregnant. On the surface, everything looks fine. Your suburban home is clean. The milkman has already left glass bottles on the porch. Your husband is getting ready for work. The television in the living room glows with cheerful black and white programs showing smiling families in gleaming kitchens. America has won the war. The economy is booming. The future is supposed to be bright. But here's what no one tells you. The moment your pregnancy becomes visible at work, you will almost certainly be fired, not asked to take leave, not offered a reduced schedule, fired legally, without recourse, because the law doesn't protect you. There is no law. When you go to the hospital to give birth, your husband will be turned away at the door and told to wait in the lobby, where he'll smoke cigarettes for hours, while a team of male doctors manages your body like a mechanical problem to be solved. You will be injected with a drug cocktail that doesn't actually stop the pain of labor. It just erases your memory of it. You'll wake up hours later, bruised and stitched, with no conscious recollection of delivering your own child. A nurse will hand you a swaddled infant, and many women in this situation describe what happens next in strikingly similar terms. The baby feels like a stranger. That is what giving birth in 1962 actually looked like. Not the soft, focused nostalgia of Leave It to Beaver. Not the postcard image of rosy suburban motherhood that has saturated our cultural memory of the early 60s. The real experience was defined by systemic control, institutional paternalism, and a near-total absence of the rights that modern women take for granted. And the most shocking part is that most people living through it didn't fully realize it either. The average American woman in 1962 got married at 20 years old. By 21, she was often pregnant for the first time. These were not unusual circumstances. This was the cultural script, and it had very little room for improvisation. The post-war baby boom was still in full swing. The suburbs were expanding rapidly. New tract homes, identical three-bedroom houses laid out in neat rows with driveways and clotheslines and station wagons, were filling up with young families at a pace the country had never seen before. Home ownership sat around 62%. The median family income was $5,156 a year. That sounds modest by modern standards, but it had roughly doubled since 1947. For many families, it felt like prosperity. But behind that prosperity, a set of assumptions governed every aspect of a woman's life. Her value was social, it was domestic, it was maternal. And from the moment she became pregnant, those assumptions tightened around her like a vice. Picture a typical Tuesday morning for a pregnant woman in this world. She wakes early, before her husband, to make breakfast. She is somewhere in her second trimester. Her body is changing in ways she can't quite discuss openly, not at the coffee clatch with the neighbors, and certainly not at the dinner table. Pregnancy, in 1962, was called a condition. It was referred to in polite company as expecting or having a blessed event. The word pregnant itself was considered too explicit for primetime television. In fact, when Lucille Ball's pregnancy was incorporated into I Love Lucy a decade earlier, it caused a national controversy. By 1962, little had changed. She is dressed carefully. Maternity fashion of this era was not designed to celebrate the pregnant body. It was designed to conceal it. The Sears Roebuck. Fall, winter to 1962 catalog offered page after page of boxy smocks, oversized button-down shirts, and tent-like dresses with pleated waistbands, garments engineered to draw the eye away from the abdomen. The message was clear. Your body is something to be managed, minimized, and hidden from view. If she's still employed, and the window on that is closing fast, she dresses in looser clothing each morning and hopes no one at the office says anything yet. She knows what is coming. The moment her pregnancy becomes impossible to hide, she will be asked to resign. Public schools mandated that pregnant teachers leave by their 5th or 6th month. Private corporations followed the same unwritten rule. Viewing a visibly pregnant body in a professional setting was considered unseemly, There were no federal laws against any of it. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act wouldn't exist for another 16 years. Let's stay in the kitchen for a moment because this is where a large portion of her day will unfold. She makes coffee and toast. She may experience morning sickness. If her doctor has prescribed something to help, she takes it without much thought. Because in 1962, the relationship between pregnant women and pharmaceutical medication is one of almost complete trust. Doctors prescribe freely. Patients comply without question. The idea that something a physician recommends could harm an unborn child is not yet a widely internalized cultural fear. That will change. We'll come back to that. She's also watching her weight. Not for vanity, or not only for vanity, but because her obstetrician has been very clear on this point. The medical standard of 1962 holds that pregnant women should gain no more than 20 to 25 pounds. Anything beyond that is considered a medical risk, a threat to easy delivery. Doctors restrict their patients' daily caloric intake to approximately 2,200 to 2,300 calories. To enforce this, many physicians prescribe low-dose amphetamines, diet pills, to pregnant women. This is not considered alarming. It is standard clinical practice. She eats a small breakfast, perhaps a light lunch later, maybe a cigarette to take the edge off her appetite. The first Surgeon General's report linking smoking to serious health risks won't be published until 1964. In 1962, cigarettes are advertised in medical journals. Physicians smoke in hospitals. Pregnant women smoke in waiting rooms while waiting to see their obstetricians. No one warns them otherwise. Modern retrospective studies would eventually reveal the devastation this caused. Smoking just 11 to 40 cigarettes a day reduced a newborn's birth weight by up to 435 grams. Combined with alcohol, also casually consumed by many pregnant women in this era, the risk to fetal development was staggering and utterly unpoliced. She drives to the A&P in the late morning. 30% of American households still receive their milk in glass bottles from a milkman, and hers arrived at dawn. At the supermarket, she buys a small mountain of convenience foods: canned condensed soup, frozen TV dinners, Jell-O molds, boxes of instant mashed potatoes. For the nursery, she'll need Pablum, the vitamin-fortified infant cereal developed in Toronto that has become the standard for new babies. Maybe some evaporated milk and Caro syrup to make homemade formula, since commercial alternatives are expensive and hard to find. Goldfish crackers, newly introduced this year by Pepperidge Farm, have just appeared on shelves after the company's founder discovered them on a trip to Switzerland. The store is a small piece of normalcy. But even here, the weight of expectation presses down because she knows the social rules. She knows how to carry herself. She knows she must appear cheerful, composed, gracious. The culture demands that pregnancy be performed as a kind of quiet, dignified femininity. She must not complain about her symptoms. She must not express fear about childbirth, not even to her friends, and she must certainly not question her doctor. In 1962, the medical establishment treats pregnancy as what one clinical paper formally calls a pathologic process, a disease state to be managed by experts. The expert is almost always male. He holds the authority. The patient defers. This is not questioned. It simply is. Here is something that should stop you cold. Toward the end of 1962, a story is filtering across the Atlantic from Europe that is generating quiet, creeping horror among pregnant American women. In Germany, the UK, and across Europe, thousands of babies have been born with devastating limb deformities, a condition called phocomelia, where infants arrive with short, malformed arms and legs, their hands growing almost directly from their shoulders. In the most severe cases, they resemble, as reporters grimly note, seal flippers. The cause has been traced to a drug called thalidomide, sold in Europe as an extraordinarily effective morning sickness remedy and sleeping pill. It had been praised as virtually suicide-proof, perfectly safe, a breakthrough. It was not. The United States was spared the worst of this catastrophe by a single person, a recently hired FDA reviewer named Dr. Frances Kelsey. She had received the application to approve thalidomide for American sale under the trade name Kevadon. She reviewed it. She found the supporting evidence inadequate. She refused to approve it and kept refusing despite relentless pressure from the manufacturer, Richardson Merrill, and their pharmaceutical lobbyists. Kelsey stood firm. That resistance was almost unthinkable in the culture of the time. And yet she held. She saved thousands of American babies from deformity. But here's the part that doesn't make it into the feel-good version of this story. Before Kelsey's blockade took full effect, Richardson Merrill had already distributed more than 2.5 million experimental thalidomide pills to American doctors, who gave them to pregnant patients without their consent or knowledge, under a loophole that allowed drugs to be dispensed experimentally before formal approval. The company had also discovered birth defects in their own rat studies and had hidden those findings from the FDA, submitting misleading partial data instead. President Kennedy awarded Kelsey the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service in August 1962. She became briefly famous. 4 years later, she was demoted, following industry-spread rumors that she had blocked the drug out of laziness. For pregnant women in 1962, the thalidomide scare was a wound that didn't close. They had taken pills on doctors' orders, trusting completely, and it had taken a single bureaucrat's stubbornness to stop catastrophe. How many other drugs had they taken? What else had they been given without question? The anxiety quietly settled in, and yet something else was happening that October, something much larger. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the United States and the Soviet Union to the edge of nuclear war. For 13 days in October 1962, the world held its breath. Schools conducted duck-and-cover drills. Families stocked fallout shelters in their backyards. Newspapers ran headlines that would be unthinkable in any ordinary year. Pregnant women carrying the next generation experienced this terror differently from everyone else, because they were not just afraid for themselves. They were afraid for what they were bringing into the world. The domestic ideal of the era. The warm, secure suburban home, the cheerful neighborhood, the American dream realized in brick and crabgrass, was balanced on top of a nuclear abyss. Every pregnant woman in America in October 1960 understood, in some quiet part of herself, that the world her child would enter might not survive the month. It did survive. But the anxiety never fully left. Let's return to the hospital, because this is where the reality of 1962 becomes most difficult to comprehend. The medicalization of childbirth had been building for decades. In the early 20th century, only a third of births took place in hospitals. By 1962, hospital birth was the absolute middle-class standard. Home births had been almost entirely displaced, and with the hospital came the full machinery of mid-century obstetric medicine. When a woman went into labor, she was admitted to an assembly line system. First, routine pubic shaving, then a chemical enema, then the waiting room. For her husband, who was strictly barred from the delivery area. He sat in a lobby, smoking, waiting for hours for news to be delivered to him like a transaction. Inside, the laboring woman received her first injection. The defining medical technology of childbirth in 1962 was something called twilight sleep, or in German Dämmerschlaf, which translates roughly as twilight state. It had been developed in Freiburg, Germany in 1903. By the 1960s, it was standard practice in American hospitals. The cocktail consisted of morphine, for pain, and scopolamine, an amnesic deliriant. Here's the crucial distinction. Twilight sleep did not stop the pain of labor. The morphine dulled it, but scopolamine did not block sensation. What scopolamine did was temporarily disrupt the brain's ability to form conscious memories. The pain happened. The woman experienced it. She just couldn't remember it afterward. What actually occurred during that gap in memory was something hospitals worked hard to keep out of public view: Under the influence of scopolamine, women entered states of violent, disoriented delirium. They screamed, they thrashed, they hallucinated. Because they could not follow verbal instructions, doctors could not ask them to push. Because they were physically out of control, hospitals developed protocols. Laboring women were strapped to their beds with heavy leather restraints. Their eyes were covered with gauze. Their ears were plugged with oil-soaked cotton to prevent sensory stimulation from triggering further agitation. When the baby needed to be delivered and the mother was unconscious or unresponsive, doctors turned to forceps, heavy metal surgical instruments inserted into the birth canal to physically grip the infant's skull and extract it. Forceps delivery today is a rare, high-risk emergency procedure. In 1962, it was standard clinical convenience. And because the drugged women couldn't brace or cooperate, doctors performed routine episiotomies, surgical cuts to the perineum, on almost every patient, often without asking. The result for many women was rampant pelvic floor damage, severe tearing, and lasting incontinence. For some infants, it meant skull fractures, bruising, and nerve damage from the grip of the forceps. And then there is this detail which you need to sit with for a moment. The morphine and scopolamine administered to the mother didn't stay in the mother. It crossed the placenta. Babies were routinely born deeply sedated, unable to breathe on their own, dissociated, limp. The classic mid-century cinematic trope of a doctor vigorously spanking a newborn to make it cry was not a theatrical affectation. It was a desperate physical intervention to revive a severely medicated infant who was not breathing. The mother woke up hours later, bruised, stitched, exhausted. A nurse placed a swaddled baby in her arms. She had no memory of delivering it. Many women who gave birth in this era describe, in almost identical terms, a feeling of profound disconnection. The infant felt, as more than one woman put it, like a complete stranger's baby. This wasn't weakness, it wasn't a failure of maternal instinct. It was the predictable psychological consequence of a medical system that had chemically severed a woman from the birth of her own child. And then, in the days and weeks that followed, hospital policy kept the baby in a central nursery. Mothers were permitted only brief, scheduled feeding visits. New mothers were kept in the hospital for up to 11 days following an uncomplicated birth. Mandated bed rest, framed as recovery, that further isolated them from their infants and reinforced the institution's control over the entire experience. At home, the work was waiting. The domestic sphere of 1962 demanded an extraordinary expenditure of physical labor that the era's television programs systematically erased from view. Disposable diapers existed. Pampers had launched in 1961, but they were an expensive luxury that most families couldn't afford for daily use. This meant cloth diapers, which required washing, boiling in large steel pots on the stove to sterilize them, hanging on outdoor clotheslines to dry, and folding with safety pins. Multiple times, every day, lifting heavy pots of near-boiling water, hauling wet fabric, all while recovering from childbirth. The domestic division of labor was absolute. The husband earned. The wife managed the home. Fathers in 1962 were not expected to change diapers, prepare bottles, or comfort crying infants at night. They were providers, a role understood as complete in itself. The emotional and physical weight of childcare rested entirely with the mother. She turned for guidance to Dr. Benjamin Spock's Baby and Child Care, the parenting Bible of the post-war generation. Spock had revolutionized child-rearing philosophy by encouraging warmth and common sense over the rigid, scheduled parenting fashionable in the 1930s. His book was the best-selling publication in America after the Bible. Millions of families took his advice as gospel. And here is where the story turns dark in a way that took decades to fully understand. Starting with the 1958 edition of his manual, Spock explicitly instructed parents to place their infants to sleep on their stomachs, face down in the prone position, to prevent them from choking on vomit. This recommendation was entirely untested. No clinical studies supported it, but it came from Dr. Spock, and so millions of mothers followed it faithfully, tucking their babies in face down each night, believing they were doing exactly what the safest expert in the country had told them to do. Prone sleeping, we now know, dramatically increases the risk of sudden infant death syndrome. More recent estimates suggest that Spock's recommendation may have contributed to as many as 50,000 avoidable infant deaths across the Western world before the advice was finally reversed. Those deaths were attributed to SIDs. Their connection to a single recommendation in a best-selling paperback wasn't widely understood for years. Beyond medicine and domesticity, the financial reality of 1962 constructed a kind of invisible cage. A pregnant woman had essentially no financial autonomy. Before the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, banks routinely refused to allow married women to open bank accounts, apply for credit cards, or secure home loans without their husband's written signature. A married woman was, in financial terms, legally subservient to her husband. A single, divorced, or widowed woman of childbearing age was treated even worse. Banks assumed she would eventually get pregnant, leave work, and become an unacceptable credit risk. She was denied credit on the basis of her biology. When young couples applied for mortgages, lenders routinely discounted the wife's income by 50 to 100% in their calculations. Her salary was considered temporary, unreliable, subject to disappearance the moment pregnancy arrived. This was not unusual policy. It was standard practice, and it played out in small, relentless ways. A hospital birth cost roughly $100 to $150 in 1962, the equivalent of about 2 full weeks of pre-tax income for a young family. That was manageable for some. But for the 20% of American families living on less than $3,000 a year, it was a genuine financial crisis layered on top of everything else. Now consider what happened if the pregnancy was outside of marriage. For an unmarried pregnant woman in 1962, the social consequences were total and immediate. Premarital pregnancy was not treated as a personal circumstance. It was treated as a psychiatric disorder. The medical and psychological establishment formally classified it as a psychological deficit. Evidence of neurosis, of female mental instability. Social workers and doctors didn't simply manage the situation, they pathologized it. Families, desperate to protect their reputations, sent pregnant daughters, often teenagers, to remote, church-run maternity homes. These institutions operated under conditions of strict secrecy. Girls were given false names. They were isolated from family and friends. They were subjected day after day to a systematic message. You are unfit to be a mother. You must give your baby up. It's the only responsible choice. It's for the baby's own good. More than 80% of unmarried white women who entered these institutions during the so-called baby scoop era, which ran roughly from 1945 to 1973, were coerced into signing away their parental rights. Between 1945 and 1973, approximately 4 million parents had their babies placed for adoption, 2 million of those in the 1960s alone. Adoption consent forms were sometimes signed under extreme psychological duress. In some documented cases, signatures were forged. Birth certificates were permanently sealed, engineered to prevent mothers and children from ever finding each other. This was not fringe behavior. It was institutionalized, legally reinforced, and deeply normalized within the social fabric of the era. And the racial dimension of this system was equally brutal. While white unmarried mothers were funneled into adoption pipelines to supply white middle-class couples with infants, black single mothers were largely excluded from that system. Not out of compassion, but because demand for black infants in the adoption market was lower. They faced their own crushing economic and social marginalization, navigating a parallel world with even fewer protections. The maternal mortality rate of 1962, 37 deaths per 100,000 live births, was already sobering. For black mothers, the risk was 2.5 to 3 times higher. That disparity was not an accident. It was the product of segregated medical care, underfunded hospitals, and a medical system that extended its full paternalism only to those it deemed worth the effort. When you step back from all of this, a picture emerges that is more complicated than either the nostalgic version of the era or its harshest caricature. There were women in 1962 who loved their pregnancies, who felt supported by their communities, who had attentive physicians and stable marriages and the kind of domestic contentment that television programs depicted. That was real. The post-war economic boom genuinely improved material conditions for millions of families. The suburbs provided something, space, community, safety, ownership, that hadn't existed for previous generations. But the comfort was conditional. It came at the cost of autonomy. The price of the gleaming kitchen and the tidy neighborhood was the legal right to a bank account, the physical sovereignty over your own body during childbirth, the professional future you might have had, and, if you were unmarried, sometimes your child. The year 1962 was also, quietly, the beginning of something. The thalidomide near-disaster didn't just scare pregnant women. It shattered the cultural assumption that doctors and pharmaceutical companies were infallible. It forced a reckoning. In October 1962, Congress passed the Kefauver-Harris Drug Amendment, which for the first time required pharmaceutical companies to prove their drugs were both safe and effective before they could go to market. It established the foundation for modern clinical trials and patient-informed consent. Dr. Francis Kelsey's stubborn refusal to sign a form had, in an indirect but unmistakable way, fundamentally changed the relationship between patients and medicine. The Feminine Mystique, Betty Friedan's groundbreaking examination of the suffocating suburban ideal, would be published in February 1963. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act would follow in 1978, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act in 1974, the Back to Sleep campaign, which would reverse the prone sleeping advice and save thousands of infant lives, would begin in 1992. These changes didn't come from nowhere. They came from the accumulated weight of experiences like the ones described here, the women who woke up from chemically induced amnesia, holding strangers, the women fired from jobs they needed, the girls shipped to institutional homes and told to forget their children, the mothers who lost babies to advice they had no reason to question. What modern audiences most misunderstand about this era is that the people living through it were not, by and large, aware of how comprehensively their experience was being managed. They had no baseline comparison. The options they didn't have were invisible to them. The pain they couldn't remember hadn't happened, as far as their minds were concerned. The laws that didn't protect them had never protected them, so their absence wasn't felt as a loss. This is how systems of control sustain themselves, not through overt cruelty, but through the quiet normalization of conditions that ensure compliance before resistance becomes possible. There is a temptation, looking back at 1962, to feel only outrage on behalf of the women who lived it. But that flattens something important. These women were not simply victims. They were navigating an extraordinarily demanding set of circumstances with whatever tools they had: intelligence, humor, community, love, sheer physical endurance. Many of them raised remarkable children. Many of them were happy in the ways that any life contains happiness alongside its constraints. What we owe them is not pity. What we owe them is honesty about what their lives actually looked like. Not the sanitized version, not the postcard, not the sitcom. Because understanding where we came from is the only way to understand clearly where we are, and to know, with any precision, which direction we're still moving.